In this section, we're going to have a look at a couple of different rating scales that are commonly used, and we'll then go on to have a look at how we can integrate questions using those rating scales into our user tests. So the two rating scales we'll explore are both the Likert and the Semantic differential scales. Both commonly used, both really quite straightforward, and also both capable in terms of what we can use them to gather or to glean insight into. For Likert scales then, first of all, they provide a statement to which we ask the user to provide their level of agreement with that statement. Now, the statements, we could word them positively or we could word them negatively. We could ask the user if they found the system easy to use or if they thought the system was not easy to use. In all cases, we give the user a scale across which they can indicate their level of agreement. And there's a couple of options. You can see them here. A 5-point scale is very commonly used, where you would have options from strongly disagree all the way across to strongly agree, with sort of a neutral point in the middle. You can also see it expressed as a 7-point scale, where again we have our anchor point, strongly disagree, strongly agree, and the user indicates where their value fits across that scale. For Likert scales, they typically, not always, but typically they use an odd number of responses. That means there is a middle point that's there, and that middle point represents neither a disagree or neither agree response. It's a neutral response. Whenever we're setting questions, and this applies to both Likert as it does to the semantic differential, we should avoid the use of strong adverbs in the questions or the statements that we're putting forward. So we should not ask the user if they felt the system was very easy to use, because the very again shifts the scale in ways that it makes it hard to compare or to understand the data we get back. We should just simply ask them, was the system easy to use, and look at their agreement with that statement. For semantic differential scales then, quite similar. Is in this case here we're providing two anchor points, and there's going to be a bipolar set of words. So we'll use a word and its opposite, and we'll present those word pairings on either side of the scale, and we'll ask the user to rank whereabouts they fit across that scale. Maybe a 5-point, could be a 7-point scale. They would be commonly used. So you can see an example here. We might show the user an interface and ask them, well, do they think, how would they assess that interface? And on one end, we're defining it to be, well, it's an ugly interface. And the other end, we're defining it to be a beautiful interface. And we're asking them to indicate where they fall across that scale. If we're doing this and using this approach, it's quite important we use word pairings that are opposites. And that needs to be clearly perceived by all of the people that we're asking the question to. If they're not truly opposites, we will confuse the users, and they're going to be uncertain about how one thing morphs into another thing if they don't view them as bipolar inside their own, how they conceptualize them. Thankfully, there's lots of good published word pairing lists that we can use. So if we're using this type of question, we should refer to published lists in terms of making sure we're selecting then word pairings that are opposites and will be safely interpreted as opposites. And you can see some examples here that we may have sort of meaningless or meaningful, time-saving, time-consuming, comfortable, uncomfortable. So they're all clearly the opposite of one another. In terms of general guidelines then for rating scales, there's 3 points here. They apply to both Likert and semantic differential. They're all quite good ones. So the first one is that if we're crafting questions alongside them providing an appropriate rating scale for it, it's not an easy thing to do. It can be quite a difficult and challenging thing to do. Thankfully, there's lots of existing question banks that are available out there that have been carefully crafted and well tested. So unless you have a need for something very, very specific, it's good to check what question banks are available and to leverage them if they're fit for purpose in terms of what you want to test. Triangulation is really useful. So in this sense, if we wanted to test if the users found our system frustrating, we might ask a number of different questions that approach that from slightly different ways, using slightly different terms or slightly different questions. Some of them we may word positively, some of them we may word negatively. And when we get our data back, we can look across that set of questions to see if the trends are the same across those questions. And if they are, then that gives us a good, solid evidence base that that is something that the users have broadly expressed. So for important topics, make sure we include several different questions that approach it from different angles so we can triangulate our results. And the final point then is it's a good one. Quite often, in fact probably in most cases, a neutral response to a statement is entirely satisfactory. It makes good sense. The user may not agree or disagree, they may just actually be in the middle and not have any strong views with regard to something. That's fine. We need to, however, also be aware of what's known as a social desirability bias. Whereas if we're asking the user directly, then the user is likely to feel that they will want to provide answers that they think we will want to hear, or that they will perceive as being more sort of socially desirable or socially correct. So that means that even though the user may not like something, they may be less inclined actually to express that directly to us and end up using sort of a neutral on the fence response. So sometimes if we take away that neutral response and provide a slightly positive and slightly negative response, and it's a choice between the two, we can get better insights then into some of the aspects that the users don't like but don't particularly want to highlight to our face. So that covers then a number of different rating scales and how we can use them. Next couple of slides we're going to look at then how do we use questions, be it the Likert or Semantic differential, how do we integrate them into the types of user testing that we will do. So when to collect self-reported data, and in fact the next two talks after this are going to look at that in more detail. We have a couple of options. We could get the user to do a particular task. Now we may be measuring error rates and task completion times, that's fine, but get the user to do something and we could ask them some questions immediately after they've done it. So that's post-task ratings. So do something, immediately ask something. We could also get the user to do several different things, and then at the end of the session we could say, ask them some questions, give them the questionnaire at that point to try to gather their overall experiences across that session. They both have their strengths and advantages, and you may want to use both of these metrics and mechanisms. If we're asking the user to answer the questions immediately after having done the task, that's good to capture those things that are related to that. If the user found anything confusing or uncertain, that type of information is unlikely to be retained in terms of their memory, so get them to do it and then let's check to see if that's, well, it's still fresh in their mind. Whereas for questions at the end of the section, there the users had a greater opportunity to establish those sort of overarching views in terms of their reflections around how the system has worked, what it doesn't work, what they like, what they don't like, what they feel overall. So they're good things then to measure and to ask about at the end of the session. It is important to be aware of biases in this. And we talked about this on the last slide then, that if we're asking somebody directly, either face-to-face, over the phone, anything like that, they're talking to us. Social desirability bias will kick in, and that's something we should be mindful of. If it's entirely anonymous, we're much more likely then to get honest user feedback. So as a takeaway from this here, because we don't want to bias our data in any way, when we're collecting our data, we should go out of our way to make sure then that we do it in a way that is anonymous. And if we can't do that, we should make sure that we don't have any experimenters looking at the users. They can do it in a way where they're unobserved. They can do it in a way where they think then that it's not personally identifiable in terms of the feedback that they are providing. Analysing ratings then, so this is actually normally quite straightforward, but there's a few important elements in it. If we take our strongly disagree to strongly agree, let's say it's a 5-point scale, we can numerically map that from a 0 to 4 or from 1 to 5. Quite often it's good to include a 0 in this here. And that then gives us a way of looking at some of our statistical techniques for analysing the data that we have received. Strictly speaking, in terms of this here, it's not interval data, but it's if it's a 5 or a 7-point scale, it's maybe sufficiently similar to interval type data if we've carefully constructed the questions that we can treat it as such. But that's a modelling assumption. There is some important elements we need to be careful of in this here. We should always look at the frequency distribution when we're collecting our feedback from the users. In a lot of cases, for example, let's say task completion time and things like this, we quite often make an implicit assumption that it's going to be normally distributed. There'll be an average task completion time. Most users will be around it with some small number of outliers. For user evaluations and user ratings, that may not be the case. We may find that we have bimodal distributions, that some users love it, some users hate it, and there's not really too many in that sort of neutral or middle ground. So always look at the distribution and be careful then about using any of our parametric measurements because a lot of those do assume we have normally distributed data. So we need to be careful then of the information we collect through this here that we don't use an inappropriate statistical technique to infer some information about it. Now that's all we want to cover in this particular section. In the next one we're going to go on to have a look at post-task ratings. So these are ones that we get to do a task, then we're going to ask the user to evaluate something immediately after that task.